So today we're going to discuss the three major schools of Buddhism, the differences that they have in contemporary practice. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. And one of the ways that we can get along that path, of course there are many ways. One of the ways is to join a local sangha, get in touch with a local Buddhist group in your area. Now, of course, I'm saying I'm from the Secular Buddhist Association, but we're open to everything. And of course, there's so many different ways that one can practice Buddhism or study and practice Buddhism. So it's important to have, I think, an introduction to the different ways for those of us who really aren't very familiar with this, just to get an idea of which school's practice style or which school's approach might be right for you. And I should say in introduction here that I have personal experience with several of these, but by no means with all of them. There's so many different options. And so what I would love for you to do is put your own experiences down below. If you have experience with one of the schools that I'm going to discuss and you think I've left something out or misdescribed something, because there's so many different ways, even within a school, that these things get realized, that I don't want to, nothing I'm saying here is going to be absolutely conclusive. All I'm going to be giving you is sort of some general overviews, and you may find very big differences in the particular sangha that you're going to go to. And so it'd be interesting to know your own experiences, or with experience with other schools that I don't mention, or other parts that I don't mention, because Buddhism is an enormous, enormous thing, and there's no way to get it across in a short lecture. I should also say that my interest is in early Buddhism. That is the kind of practice style you would have found there. Not that I want to follow it exactly, but at least I'm interested in how it would have looked. And of course, being a secular practitioner, my practice is based upon that, but with a secular take. And I'll get to a little of that at the end. But that's just as background. So everyone has their own biases and interests, and so those are my interests going forward. Although I'm going to, in what follows, I'll try to be as objective as I can. So again, if there's something that you think I've overlooked or misdescribed, it was not intentional, please just put it down below. So to begin with Theravāda practice, and Theravāda is a school from Southeast Asia, which also now exists in the West. It's what's mostly behind what we would call contemporary mindfulness practice or insight Buddhism. I have a local sangha in New York, a New York Insight, that I'm most familiar with, and that's an example of a contemporary insight type of practice. And in general, insight practice is going to be less devotional, less interested in devotional practices, less ritualized, less interested in ritual, less interested in aesthetics. So you're probably not going to have incense. You won't have that many bells. You might have one bell, but that's about it. People will not generally be dressing up in robes at any level unless you have a monastic coming to visit. So they appear to be lay centers. They're also generally less hierarchical. That is to say, you generally will not have a single teacher or guru who is considered the guiding teacher of the whole center, or if you do, they'll guide in a very vague way rather than sort of laying down the law as to what they're going to teach. It's a much more, I would say, if you'd like, democratic in a sort of a small d sense than other kinds of Buddhism, which probably stems from the idea of the Sangha, which in history was somewhat democratic. I mean, it was something where decisions were come to in general discussion or by general discussion. And I would say in general, they're more interested in sort of rational or conceptual clarity with their teachings, as opposed to other schools such as Zen, which I'll get to in a moment. They'll try as much as they can to give you reasons for what you're doing, the texts that you read, which will be a lot of what will give you reasons, are texts from the Pali material usually, the Pali Canon, which was composed around the 5th century BCE, and also you'll look at later interpreters of those texts, such as Buddhaghosa from the 5th century of the Common Era, and a lot of centers will use more contemporary writers and thinkers from the West who are interpreting these texts nowadays. but they will usually have excerpts from the original texts and go back to them as sort of the root texts for what they're discussing. And given the focus on those texts, of course, the focus in general is going to be on the Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, insofar as we know of what the historical Buddha was like. And of course, there are all kinds of interpretations surrounding that person, some that are, let's say, more fanciful than others, but in general, that's the focus, is on the person of the Buddha, the historical Buddha. And so, for example, you'll have, in general, if you go to one of these sanghas, you'll have a room that's oriented towards, not usually a statue of the Buddha. And so, for example, here's a photograph from New York Insight that I took recently, and you can see that the Buddha has a very prominent place. There's also, it just so happens, a Mahāyāna statue there as well, which goes to show that many of these contemporary centers are relatively ecumenical nowadays. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But nevertheless, the Buddha is generally the focus, and there's little else that surrounds the Buddha. The objective in practice in a Theravāda context is going to become awakened, to become what's called an arahant, insofar as that's possible. In any event, we're trying to get up that ladder. We're trying to reduce greed, reduce hatred, reduce our ignorance, in the relevant context. And there's generally little emphasis on topics such as Buddha nature, which you may have heard, such as non-duality, which you may have heard, such as emptiness. These are concepts you generally find in the other schools of Buddhism, not so much in the Theravāda school, which is because those concepts are later concepts. They don't go back to the Pali Canon, at least not in the way that they're used later on. You can find aspects of them early on, but in general, if you look at the early texts, those are not the focus of practice, or at least they're interpreted in different ways, could be interpreted in different ways. I should also say that insofar as you ever meet up with a monastic in that context, they're quite strict. They do follow celibacy, they are celibate, they will follow the rules of the ancient Vinaya insofar as they can, and in general, they don't have to be vegetarian. Because the early Sangha was not vegetarian, although many of them will be nowadays. The second major school is the school of Mahāyāna Buddhism. That's probably the most famous school around the world. It encompasses such styles of Buddhist practice as Zen, which is probably the most famous, as Pure Land Buddhism, also very famous, and as Tibetan Buddhism. Although Tibetan Buddhism we're going to also see in the third section, but Tibetan Buddhism is considered a branch of Mahāyāna Buddhism. In general, it's a style of Buddhist practice that's more devotional. So, for example, in the Pure Land, you have really is focused simply around devotion to Amitabha Buddha, one particular who's seen as a Buddha from the past. The point of practice is to repeat certain mantras in order to invoke the compassion of this Buddha, so that you're reborn into a better life. Along with that devotion, it's generally, Mahāyāna practice tends to be more ritualized. There's more ritual involvement, more things that you do because they're part of the ritual. It's also more aestheticized practice in general than Theravāda. So you will have incense, you may have incense, you may have different kinds of bells or sounds. People may all be in robes, you may have to wear a robe. I've done Zen practice both where we didn't have to wear robes, that was quite westernized, and where we did have to wear robes. And in that secondary type, that was nice because for visitors they had robes that you could put on if you didn't have one, and obviously for the regulars they had their own. And the rooms will generally be more elaborate, more constructed, more aesthetically distinct from a normal room, whereas in Theravāda practice often that won't be the case. Again, westernized Theravāda practice. We're not talking about so much the ones that are traditional Theravāda within Southeast Asia. I should also mention about Southeast Asia that you will, at times within Southeast Asian viharas or monastic centers, you will not necessarily only have an image of the Buddha. You might have lots of different images. It differs from place to place. So I'm just, these things, I'm talking about the general overview rather than specifics. Also, in general, a Mahāyāna practice is more guru-based, more teacher-based, and more hierarchical. There's more of an idea that your focus is on, let's say, the text that the teacher wrote himself or herself, and the practice that the teacher himself or herself suggests that you do, rather than in, let's say, an insight or mindfulness practice where you may have a rotating group of teachers or guest teachers, and you just deal with the one that's in front of you today if you want. However, if you meet monastics, sometimes in some of the schools, they're significantly less strict about the rules that surround them. So, for example, in Zen, many of the teachers or even the abbots will be married. We'll have spouses, which is not allowed in Theravāda Buddhism and early Buddhism for that matter. And you'll have some temples that even do things like brew their own sake, such as the Amano-san Kangoji Temple in Japan, which brewed its own sake for a long period of time. And that would not, of course, be completely impossible in different cultures, because alcohol was seen as one of the things that we avoided. And in some of the schools, particularly in Zen, there's more of an interest in breaking through cognition, in using paradoxical kinds of stories or tales, or called koans, to try to break our reliance on reason and analysis in order to understand the world. And what I said in the prior section about Theravada was that it tended to be more rational. In Zen, it's sort of more irrational or more non-rational. And the texts that they look at are from a later period than the Pali Canon. That is to say, the Mahāyāna texts in general were from the early centuries BCE, maybe the 1st century, 2nd century BCE, but most of them are written in the Common Era. And this is, of course, I'm talking from a scholarly point of view. From within the tradition, they're seen as coming from the Buddha himself, but modern scholars don't see it that way. They see them as later texts that were imputed to the Buddha. The third major school of Buddhism is called Vajrayāna Buddhism. Vajrayāna means the thunderbolt Buddhism, or thunderbolt vehicle. But in certain ways, the Vajrayāna sees itself as part of the Mahāyāna. However, there are many people within the Mahāyāna that see the Vajrayāna as separate. So this is one of these controversies that we're not going to try to overcome here, but nevertheless, I wanted to make that clear to you. And it's what we might call a form of, what's called a form of Tantric Buddhism. Tantra is a difficult word to actually understand, but it involves a number of things that we're going to get to. And in the West, this form of Buddhism, Vajrayāna Buddhism, is generally found within a Tibetan context, because much of Tibetan Buddhism nowadays is Vajrayāna Buddhism. And I think most distinctly, it's sort of more Mahāyāna than the Mahāyāna in the respects that we've been discussing till now. It tends to be intensely guru-based, intensely hierarchical. So you're really supposed to be, you really can't practice without a guru, without a teacher. And so you find your teacher, and then you practice pretty much one-on-one with them for however long it takes. It can be years. And the practice can involve very intense and difficult and long visualizations, in particular visualizing yourself as certain kinds of deities. In order to break through, it's said, some of our mental tendencies. In other words, the visualizations you're supposed to do are constructed in order to break through some of these tendencies. So, and devotional practices are central to this. Initiation rites, so there's lots of ritual involved in this, in particular initiation rites that are supposed to confer certain kinds of power. They're also supposed to bind you to particular teachers in certain ways, or particular deities or supernatural beings. There's also an extensive use of what's called mantras and mudras, mantras being certain kinds of statements that you say over and over to yourself in a kind of meditative context. They can either be things that actually have meaning within, let's say, Sanskrit or Tibetan, or they can be meaningless phrases, meaningless strings of sounds that are supposed to rise within you certain kinds of feelings or certain kinds of intended mental states. And mudras are hand gestures, which are very, very famous nowadays. We see them on Buddhist sculptures everywhere, and they have meaning, but they do not go back to the earliest stratum of Buddhism. And in the Pali Canon, we don't have any evidence of mudras being important at all. So these kinds of really what amount to magical practices a lot of it did not come from the earliest stratum. A lot of it came from later Buddhist tendencies. Some of it seems to have either come from or co-arose with similar tendencies in proto-Hinduism and early Hinduism, in particular Shaivism, the early Shaivite cults. There's a great book about the arising of of Tantra and Yoga, which I'll link down below, a scholarly book. It's lengthy and dense, but if you're interested in some of the potential roots of that, it's a good place to start. Also, and critically, and this is one of the sort of hallmarks of Vajrayāna Buddhism, is that the texts are seen as potentially, as very powerful. It's called the Thunderbolt School because it's supposed to be the one school that can really get you to awakening right away. It can get you, in other words, they say that, the Mahāyāna path is very lengthy, the early path is very lengthy, it can take multiple lifetimes or thousands of lifetimes or whatever, but their path is pretty much immediate. It can within a single lifetime, it can get you there. But it does it through what it considers, and it can be, people who practice it consider to be potentially dangerous practices, potentially transgressive practices. And so a lot of it is secret. A lot of it is the sort of thing that's only transmitted between a teacher, a guru, and a student, and that is not written down. And for this reason, some aspects of Vajrayāna Buddhism are hard to study academically because there just isn't data about it. It's kept secret within the tradition. And historically, some of these practices included sexual practices, practices with forbidden kinds of substances like alcohol, but that's not the case in every practice, and some gurus, some teachers very much resist that aspect of it, but historically it was definitely part of the practice, and in Shaivite practice it was as well. And the texts that you read are likely to be from later texts from the Common Era, or texts from the guru himself or herself. You're probably not going to be reading anything from the Pali Canon or the early material at all. It's going to be stuff that's much more recent. Okay, now broadly within both Vajrayāna and Mahāyāna, there are certain kinds of similarities to practice that I should go through. In both contexts, there is a focus on a whole pantheon of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So you'll have not only the historical Buddha, but he will be viewed as one of many historical Buddhas, going back into history throughout the eons, and also Bodhisattvas, these beings who have been reborn through lifetime after lifetime in order to help other people without themselves being Buddhas. And these generally will have aspects to them of ways that they interact in the world. So, for example, probably the most famous Bodhisattva is Avalokiteshvara, who is the Bodhisattva of compassion, who's known in Chinese as Kuan Yin and in Japan as Kannon. And that was actually the statue that, if you remember back to the photograph I have from New York Insight, the second statue there was one of Kwannon or Avalokiteshvara, and sometimes it's in a female form and sometimes in a male form, depending on the statue, or sometimes a half of one and half of the other. So a very interesting bodhisattva figure. But if you enter into one of these, into a room that is Mahāyāna or Vajrayāna, you're going to have a lot of these different kinds of images. And there are similarities, distant similarities to, let's say, a Catholic church, where you're surrounded by saints and where every saint has his or her aspect that's relevant. And so if you're interested in a particular thing, you may direct your devotional practice to a saint in the same way. In many Mahāyāna or Vajrayāna practices, if you're interested in a particular end, you may devote your attention to one particular bodhisattva or one particular Buddha. The aim is to become a bodhisattva. The aim is not to become, the aim is eventually to become a Buddha, but the idea is that is something way, way in the future. And so right away what you want to be is a bodhisattva, which is somebody who devotes his or her life to compassion for all living beings. They're not only this life, but potentially an infinite number of lives. And so that's the point of your practice. You make a vow. A vow of practice, a bodhisattva vow, is critical to this in a way that, again, in the early tradition, you don't find it. And generally in the teachings, you're going to have a heavy emphasis on concepts such as Buddha nature or non-duality, this notion that there's no real separation between self and world, there's no real separation between two concepts that appear to be in opposition to one another, a very strong emphasis on emptiness, the notion that all things in the world are empty of own being, of self-being, of essence, even of existence. These are aspects that are brought up time and again in these practices. And they stem from the early Mahāyāna teachings, particular people like Nagarjuna and others, So these are going to be central to the kinds of teachings that you're going to hear. And I'll put a link up above to a video put out, I believe, by the British government or some aspect of the British government discussing these three kinds of Buddhism for for a school audience. So another introduction to them if you want to hear more about this. Finally, just a word about secular Buddhism. I'll do another video where I go into some of this in more detail. There's just too much to be said in one video here, but secular Buddhism in general tends to be related to early Buddhist or Theravāda kinds of practices because they're less ritualized, they're less strictly religious, and at least their overt form. Or to the Zen practice, which is also less interested in views and doctrines and more interested in simply sitting and practicing. So that is the secular Buddhist kind of approach. In a certain sense, it pulls various strands out of these prior ones and may be considered to be somewhat of its own thing. So as I said at the beginning, please, if you have your own experiences with any of these schools, I'd be interested to hear it, and I think other people would as well if they're interested perhaps in doing a study there or joining a local sangha. They might want to know what to expect. So put your own experiences down below. Fill out the picture that I've at least begun to sketch here. There's way too much to talk about in a single video. I'm so glad to have you, and thanks so much for your kind comments and questions in the past. I hope we'll see you on the next one of these videos, and meanwhile, be well.